grandfather on my father's side, the old McGregor thing is on a Spanish land grant before Mexico was even Mexico. And his mother went to Old Baylor on in the Independence, and so they were here long before Texas became Texas. And on my mother's side, she had 16 brothers and sisters.
Wow.
And nearly all of them managed to get through college. Uncle Frank taught at the University of Texas, law school. His brother R.L. Bobbitt, and that's the one that got me the job in Washington, D.C., was state attorney general, and later on lost to James Allred, the attorney general. And those brothers, sisters helped each other. Now, Granddad married twice. I mean, he married, my mother was in the older generation, and so some of my uncles weren't much older than me. But they came after the Civil War, and I remember talking to my great-grandfather at his birthday party in Austin, Texas, and he fought in the Civil War.
Wow.
So I had some military, and they were always in some kind of a scrap.
Did he say anything about the Civil War to you?
I remember at the birthday party, now I understand at 5 years old you don't get things too straight, but I remember a couple of my uncles asking him, what would you have done if you'd run to your brothers? You had 3 brothers on the other side. And he could use pretty specific language. He said, I'd have killed him just like any other blankety blank.
Born in San Antonio, you moved to Houston as a young boy. When you were growing up, your dad had been in World War I. Mm-hmm. Did he tell you any stories about that?
He went to an old country school. When he went to A&M, he was a little young. He had taken just 3 or 4 teachers in the high school, so he passed all the grades, and they gave him a diploma so when he was 14, and he went to A&M. He was 15 that summer, I guess. And so when he got out, they couldn't give him a commission. He wasn't 18 years old. And he had to wait till he was 18. And then, as I understand it, he went into the Signal Corps. And the only thing I understand about that, he must have been in balloons or something. And some fellow came down the plane and flew around there in MacArthur Field in Waco in World War I. And I don't know, I guess if they didn't get sick when they landed, well, they automatically were to become pilots. And they brought back, let's see, according to, it was Major Kidd, they had an airplane called a Gnome Rotary French airplane, and it had stubby wings, and they didn't have a teacher. They taxied around the field, and the way I understand it, they could rise maybe 5 or 6 feet, and then it'd settle back down to the ground.
Oh boy.
And then when they thought they knew how to fly, I guess they got in the full-size wings and took off. But it's a Gnome Rotary motor where the crankshaft was attached to the plane, and the whole motor revolved around the crankshaft, and the prop was attached to the motor. But it gave it a lot of torque or something, and I heard him remark that if you turned to the right, you turned into the ground. And another remark that I heard frequently was it had a takeoff speed of 90, and a cruising speed of 90, and a top speed of 90, and a landing speed of 90. And that when you wanted to land, you had to cut the engine off. You know, the whole motor was turning, you cut it off, and then if you wanted to pick up speed, you better tried to catch it while the engine was still turning so it'd start again. And but they had a lot of, I mean, I was all big ears and just listening to stuff there. I think he was reported missing in action or something, and he was in some crashes over in Europe. And my mother got word that he was missing or killed or something, and it was evidently quite upsetting at the time. Later on, he was at Kelly Field when I was born at Santa Rosa Hospital there in San Antonio.
So your dad had survived then?
My dad what?
Survived.
Yeah, he got there, and he went back into service in World War II. And he was, well, 2 or 3 places. One, he was commandant, a school commandant at Fort Hood and the tank destroyers. That's where Fort Hood was first established. And I went out with him one time, and before Fort Hood existed. And I think General Mayberry must have been his roommate at A&M. I don't know that whole part, but he took the first troops out to Fort Hood when it was first established, and I think there were 300 people in that town. It wasn't anything but about 3 or 4 buildings, maybe 1 or maybe 2 filling stations, a bank on the corner with a thing, but it was quite interesting because Fort Hood's the biggest military thing right around, I mean, here in the United States, but a little town of 300 between Temple and, I forgot the name of the Lampasas.
Now, you yourself went into the service during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
What were you drafted? Did you enlist? What was going on? And what was your mom thinking with your husband there and now you?
I had 2 younger brothers, and my dad got me into A&M late and told me what to sign up for, evidently. Because I signed up as a petroleum engineering geology student. And I went through a couple of years, but I found out the courses I had taken in high school, the so-called college courses, they went through in 6 weeks in engineering and then kept going at the same rate. And I'd never thought you took books home to do homework. I thought you listened to the prof for the first 5 or 10 minutes, and then you did whatever he told you to do for tomorrow, while he was telling others the same thing over and over. And when I got to A&M, I found out that they were teaching at a rate that I was not accustomed to, and I think I failed a couple of courses there. Younger brothers coming along, my dad went back into service, and they'd lost their home there during the Depression, just as the war started. And I went with signed up with the Department of Justice, and I had an uncle that got me the job, and was a code clerk there. I was there when they first used IBM sorting machines, and I remember while I was there, we got different nationalities that had gone back to visit their homeland and back, and where they read. I found out the United States knew a lot more about them than I thought they knew. And I remember we selected the Japanese, and I was a little upset they put the Japanese in camps or something about that time. And I came back to Waco. My 2 brothers were in Baylor University, and my mother was there, and my dad was when he was in the service. I think he was at Hood at the time, just getting things started. And when I came back, let's see, they were living on Spate Street in Waco, near Baylor, And I walked downtown, I guess it was 10, 12 blocks. And I think I saw two males. One of them looked about 12 or 13, the other looked about 50 or 60 to me. And I walked in the post office and volunteered as a private, which can upset your parents, especially if he's an officer. Went to some place called Shepherd Field and was supposed to get basic training. But I'd been in the military in high school and at A&M for a while. And the military, in its usual brilliant way, gave me a thing with a bunch of meal tickets, and I don't know, I guess it's 20, 25 incipient MPs, because they were all my size, something, and I took them to Fort Sam Houston. And I remember that I wasn't accustomed to the military of feeding them on a train with meal tickets, but we got to Fort Sam Houston, and they tried to put me in a machine records thing there. And I remember, I forgot, it was real early, or 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning or something, and they asked me what one IBM machine was, and now it's a verifier, but and I'd had verifiers and even wired up the board to make the paychecks. Used to have paychecks with little slots in them, and I'd run the sorting machines and everything there, but I wasn't there long. I remember there was a fire, and I had to walk around the Army headquarters there, and they had some pheasants that screamed and everything around there, messed things up. But then I got sent to Fort Hood in OSS and got a commission there. And then the tank destroyer sort of, they rather folded up, and I was transferred to the artillery, the 542nd Artillery Battalion, and then before I got transferred there, I went to the 5th Tank Destroyer Group, and we went out to the Mojave Desert in Arizona, about 45 miles north of Yuma, but on the Arizona side of the river. It wasn't near the river either. It was a very dry thing, and it's some kind of bombing range or something. I went back there 10 or 15 years ago, and they got a big fence and everything around there, old Chocolate Mountain on one side. And by that time I'd gotten married, and I had proposed to my wife when we were both freshmen there at A&M. I proposed to her when we were both 17 years old, and 5 years later she agreed to it. And we got married, and she came out to Holtville, California while I was stationed there in the desert, which is an interesting way to start married life, but there were a lot of interesting things happened there, maneuvers, and our group was supposed to load on ships in San Diego, go to North Africa. And there was a little invasion of North Africa before all the other stuff happened in Europe. Incidentally, I was in Washington, D.C. when Pearl Harbor happened. And my main recreation up there was going through the Smithsonian Institute and sometime the Lemon Art Gallery, but I could spend hours and hours at that Smithsonian. And as a starting engineer, it was very interesting to me to see the things they had there. And I went back later, and just a small percentage of what I was seeing, and I didn't see it all then. But I mean, I saw a little part of it. I could have spent my life going through that thing, but
Now, were you shipped off overseas eventually?
I was in the 542nd, and I asked for a pass to go see my wife, and we were in Oklahoma, if I remember. And while I was gone, the 542nd got shipped to Europe. And the outfit I was with, the ones I heard from later, they got in something called hedgerows in Normandy, and the ones that wrote to me said that they had a lot of, they're little pop-up mines. They had three little things sticking up, and if you touched them, they called them castrators. And they had quite a time, but I got shipped as a replacement for the Ardennes a little bit later on that deal. And I went out of Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, and we went in a transport. As I remember, it was a Coast Artillery transport. And we did not have an escort. And I remember there was quite a lot of things in the water just before we got to England. I mean, wreckage and oil slicks and this deal. And we landed in one side of England, Liverpool or something, in one side of England, and went on a train with various stops to the other side, and then got on an LST. And they had a storm at the time, and they put out the anchor and had the motor running, and the anchor was still dragging. And they had given me a list. There were 3 or 4 lieutenants, and I was a senior. I was a senior at that time, and we had 525 on my cadre list. And they were down on that flat deck, and that LST is made out of rubber. The front end bent one way and the back, when the back went the other, and you could look and see the middle rise up when the bow went down. The stern was sinking, and we landed at a place called Le Havre, and I remember I left my roster at the bottom of a cliff, and had to run back down and run back up that hill to catch the men. Somehow or other got them turned over, and 25 of us went as forward observers to be replaced in the Ardennes. And after a few mishaps of going to the wrong place, we were supposed to go to Neufchâteau, Belgium, or Neufchâteau, France. And in a 2.5-ton truck, whatever lieutenant, there were about 20 of us, just all of us were forward observers, replacements. We went to Neufchâteau, France. And after we got back to Belgium, then I went to the 28th Infantry Division. And I can't remember the numbers and names of things right now, but in the artillery outfit I was with, the battalion commander was one of the most decorated men in the 28th, officer in the 28th Infantry Division. And at that time, the time I got there, things were a mess. I mean, it didn't seem to me that anybody knew what in the world was happening. And one time you'd look around and you'd have 1 or 2 of your radio men or maybe a driver with you. And the next time you'd have 50 or 60 with you. And to me, they may say they've got order in the Army, but that part of the Army didn't have any order. And we we got through that particular part where they said that the MPs were replacements from Germany. They just put on MP uniforms and were directing people in the wrong direction, and there were a whole bunch of things going on. And if you were in it, you didn't see much sense in it. At least I didn't see much sense in anything. But got to fire artillery a little bit, and came back, and having had a little engineering, I decided that I wanted them to survey in the guns correctly, and I had a little class, and I found out it just wasn't my men, but the battalion commander had sent all the surveyors in there, and I looked up, and there were some stars back there, which shakes up a second lieutenant pretty bad. And a few days later, I found out I was aide-de-camp to the division artillery commander, General Perry. And I wasn't with him very long, and I noticed General Perry was a little upset and told me to see the sergeant major. Sergeant major said, well, here your order says report to division headquarters immediately. And I said, what's the matter? And he said, I don't know. I said, well, what's the general mad about? He said, I guess you'll find out. And I went up there, and I think I knew the sergeant major. And he said, well, the general doesn't like officers out of uniform, and instead of the little aide-de-camp thing that I had for General Perry with 1 star on it, he took them off and put one with 2 stars on it, and that was General Norman Dakota. Incidentally, in The Longest Day in the Year, that movie, The Landing in Normandy, John Wayne played Norman Dakota. And they were the division that landed there first in Normandy and took all those casualties coming up the hill there. And the 28th was one marched through Paris when it was an open city and closed the Fillet Gap. And they had lost so many people in Hurtgen Forest. And according to what they told me, those forests, when they're firing artillery in there, the shells would go off and blast down. So making a foxhole wasn't the answer. You had to put some logs over the top and everything. And they did that, I know, in the Bulge, the outfit I was with, they sort of liked the idea of having something on top of you. And anyway, I was with General Dakota there. I never did figure out why I was made aide-de-camp in the first place, but he and his wife were real nice, and we came back to the States, and we were set up and we're getting new equipment and everything, and they said your division has had, and of course, as you just listen, you don't say much as an aide-de-camp. And I found out that we were supposed to be a assault division on Japan proper, and the 2nd Division was at that same camp, and they were loaded up the same way. And we were there when the atomic bomb went off at Hiroshima. And there were some pretty happy people around me. And I certainly wasn't looking forward to that thing, because when you're listening to that, they count on so many casualties that this is a given when they're planning these things. And they didn't plan to get on Japan proper without losing, I'm not talking about a few hundred, I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of casualties. And that, for a 23 or 4-year-old youngster, that didn't look like it was very nice to me. But my dad was in the service, and he was taking troops over in the Pacific. And my brother was in the Pacific, flying something called C-46s. He called them toilet paper runs. I know they met at Guadalcanal. he landed and they were still shooting there or something, and he couldn't take off. And I found out later on his toilet paper runs were taking supplies and everything in the little short beaches and landing fields to emergency supplies to troops on the attack. And then he was supposed to take casualties or something back out. And he and my father met there at Guadalcanal.
This war came to an end, and then you went back into Korea.
This war came to an end, and I spent a little time in the hospital. And no, I got out. One of the things but they didn't, by getting out, they kept me in the reserve. I mean, you just didn't get out at that time. And I went back to A&M and took some classes. I've forgotten where I got a master's, and I did get an engineering degree, but it was not in petroleum engineering and geology. I just finished an engineering degree in ag engineering. And my wife and I were teaching in Livingston, Texas. And I got a notification. My father-in-law called me about that. I just went to the old address, and it said, "Greetings, you're notified to return to the service," or something. And I went back in, and I was on orders to go to Korea. And an Army artillery battalion. And come to think of it, there were 3 or 4 others on the same orders. But the battalion I was with was being shipped to Germany, sir, in New Orleans. And we had some trouble loading things up with everything. Anyway, those orders came through to go to Korea, and my battalion commander got excited and called everybody and says, "You can't take our loading officer," or something. And so I just went with the outfit. After we got loaded, I went back over to Europe and stayed at the Hart Kaserne in Schwäbisch Gmünd in Germany, and that's out of Stuttgart, and spent most of the time in Grafenwohr and flying back and forth and watching the Czech border. And we were waiting for the Russian planes to take off. It was a lot touchier than, I mean, over there we were under some kind of emergency, it seemed, constantly. But I tried to get my wife over there one time, and suddenly they sent me back to Grafenwohr, and that was just on constant flight duty there. I was an aerial observer there at Grafenwohr. I flew in these little Cessna planes. I'd been in a Piper Cub. Now those are flyable, but that Cessna has spring leaf landing gear, and the pilots all want you to be able to land those planes, and I never did get that Cessna landing gear. It doesn't have any hydraulic things, just springs. And I remember trying one time, and I think you could have put a 2-story barracks where I touched down the first time, and it bounces under me before I touched the second time. But it was an all-metal plane, and it was a lot better because, you know, our troops shoot at anything that's in the air. And you'd be amazed at how many of the planes, those little Leos, we weren't supposed to fly over 500 feet high and stay in back of our so-called lines. You'd be surprised how many holes we had in the plane where they put something under the seat. Now that was the main thing they were trying to protect at that time. but that's part of the game of life, I guess. But I was there at Camp Polk when all the war ended the first time, and then the second time I'd gotten sick, and they flew me back in a plane, and I got out of Gray Air Force Base after going to Wortham Field in Massachusetts, and I remember flying over. We landed at Washington, D.C., and it seemed like we taxied around the place for miles. But anyway, that's...
And jumping to today, you have one grown daughter?
I have a daughter that was born during World War II, and she was a little one that him and my wife, the Army was pretty rough on them. Lieutenant doesn't get too good at quarters a lot of times, and I remember we stayed in motels and hotels, and let's see, I was overseas for a while. I didn't get to see her until she was a year or so old, and then we came back. I bought a little, or I didn't buy, I paid down on a little house in College Station.
Let's pick up again with your daughter. What is she doing today?
She is retired. It's awkward to have a daughter that's almost 70 years old. And she is in McKinney with her husband, who went to A&M, is retired. He's an electrical engineer, and he was chief engineers of Brad's Electric Company, which is a pretty good size outfit.
And grandkids, how many do you have?
I have 2 grandchildren. One of them, Karen, went to Texas A&M and was qualified and acceptable in a number of medical schools, and then the love bug comes around and she gets the same degree her husband is, and IBM hired her. And she was with Global IBM for a while, and then whoever was head of it got cancer and they canceled the program. And she called her husband, who worked for EDS, as Ross Perot's old firm, and he said, well, they offered you a bonus to come to EDS too, and EDS says, we'll give you the bonus we offered and give you credit for what you've done at IBM. And so she went over there, and he's still with EDS, or it's Hewlett Packard now, who bought EDS. But she stayed there until the baby was born, and then I think she took permanent maternity leave. She's got an 8-year-old, I've got a great-granddaughter, that she has, and she's got Crohn's disease. And so she's had it pretty rough, but mentally she must be doing pretty good. I mean, IBM has really hired her. They gave her a bonus pretty good to go there, and then EDS took her on, but Crohn's is something that she's had to deal with most of her life.
Just the one great-grandchild?
No.
How many great-grandchildren in total?
I've got a great-grandson. That's my grandson's son. And let's see, he's a school principal. He's been a school principal in Round Rock, Eanes Independent School District in Austin, Austin High School in Telluride, Colorado. And I think he got homesick because he came back here and came to a place called Lake Highlands here in this area. I don't know this area too well. And 2 years ago, he went to a smaller school, but he likes it. They let him go back to Harvard and lecture or something every now and then. To Highland Park here in Dallas. He's principal there right now.
Excellent. Joel, that was great.